So, one of my favorite questions to ask and I guess ponder and contemplate is, what is this? And just sit with that. Not necessarily have an answer and just move on, but just really ask the question and explore what arises in response to that. Um, but sometimes I do find it kind of equal parts helpful and sort of enjoyable to really unpack that. What is this? And my being a non-duality enthusiast, I would say, what is this? This is non-dual. And you could go to some of the other videos I've done to see me unpack a little bit more what I mean when I say this is non-dual. But at the same time, it's also helpful to approach it from some other angles, some other conceptualizations. And so what I wanted to go through for this video is the absolute, the relative, and then the illusion. When we ask the question, what is this? What is this in the absolute sense? What is it in the relative sense? And then what is it in the illusory sense? Or another way to think about it is absolute, what is real in the relative sense? What is sort of real and unreal? It's kind of in that grayness of interpretation. And then illusion, what is unreal? Has no reality to it whatsoever. So the absolute, this is the absolute. Everything or non-thing is the absolute. It is the absolute being whatever it is. So this is absolute bodying. This is absolute talking to a camera. Over there, it's the absolute listening, seeing a computer screen. This is the absolute walling, picturing. It's all the absolute. Period. Now, what is the absolute? Well, that is a different challenge in and of itself. And there's a couple ways that I like to unpack what's being pointed to with the absolute. Because again, so to reiterate, this is the absolute. There is no other. So everything appearing to happen is the absolute appearing to happen. And it's all, there isn't a separation between absolute over there, out there, somehow mystically, magically transforming into this. That's an easy pitfall to fall into, because it's easy to other this absolute sense. Many would call it God, and I'm okay with that to a degree. But in some senses, God can come with very strong connotations that I don't think are necessary when it comes to really pondering. Again, the original question, what is this? So when it comes to pondering, what is this? This is the absolute. To say that this is God is an unnecessary leap, in my opinion. That's a preference. So this is all the absolute. And what is that? Well, the first thing to say is it's indescribable. It's unknowable. It's, I mean, one thing that I find very helpful is to just literally sit with the question like, well, what is this? Okay, this is the absolute. Okay, but what is that? But what is this is a coffee cup, right? Like, what is it? We can utilize our mental faculties and scientific findings to describe it, but that's getting into the relative, which I'll touch on in just a moment. That's getting into the relative. So what I find personally is the more that I sit with the mystery of what this is, the more there's this sinking into a comfort with like, I have no idea, no clue what this is. How could I ever know what this is? I am this body, this collection of thinking, speaking, seeing, hearing, all of that is this. So with what would I know, be able to know what this absolute is? It's indescribable, unfathomable, ineffable, and it appears to be boundless and free. That, you know, find find me a limitation to this. I don't think it can be done. This absolute. So that I think is the more, call it quote, spiritual um, pointing to the absolute. And I say spiritual in quotes because I think of spiritual as a little bit like the God concept or word, where they're fine, but they can be very misleading. So again, I don't, when we're pondering the simple question of what is this, the the step to spiritual connotations isn't necessary. It can be helpful. Again, many people come to these deep existential questions through spiritual paths, but it's not essential. So therefore, when we're asking these questions and exploring, there need not be a spiritual context to contemplate. So that's the spiritual answer. This is the absolute, and the absolute is a mystery, unknowable. And then another pointing that I enjoy for the absolute is what I refer to as a scientific absolute. And this one I think is easier for the mind to grasp, at least as far as I'm concerned. And this is, we can just think of, again, the body, our self, body, mind, faculties that appear to arise here. What is that? So this is where we can start to talk about the absolute and the relative, the absolute being the relative. Now, this body is a relative happening. It's an appearance of the absolute. And so how does science point to the absolute in this capacity? So this is a body, but what is it actually? It looks like a body, right? What is it? How's that expression? Walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. It's probably a duck. Like so, you know, the extreme majority of human beings are going to see this and see it as a body, right? As a human body. But what is it actually? And so again, in the relative sense, yes, it's a body. But in the absolute sense, it's trillions of individual cells working together to generate the appearance of a body. So in a more absolute sense, it's trillions of cells operating together to form a body. And then what are those cells? Well, you start to get into, and I'm not a scientist, so this is a very like explain like I'm five type of thing. But in the cells, there are smaller particles, trillions of those in the body, um, and then smaller and smaller and smaller particles, and then you start to get into the quantum um, subatomic particle realm, where there's a whole different set of laws with physics. Again, all the relative. When you talk about the laws of physics, that's the relative appearance of the universe, I guess we could say. And again, this is all pointing to the absolute from a scientific view, which is inherently limited. Because again, if we go back to that quote spiritual view, it's more focused on the mystery, the unknowing, that the unfathomableness of the absolute. But again, so when we talk about the scientific, there's the body that is made up of smaller and smaller and smaller particles that contain nothing, emptiness. It's like the more you take a giant microscope, the more that we zoom into anything, body, any sort of apparent matter, continually finding layers of emptiness. And that's what I kind of like, is where there is sort of a synthesis between um, a scientific view of this and the spiritual. That concept of emptiness does seem to merge to some degree. So those are sort of two ways to point to what the absolute is. And I sort of touched on what the relative is. The relative, and you may call this real and unreal, because the absolute is real. And I guess I'm hesitant to even say that, because to express something as real is almost overly presumptuous. Because with what faculties would we know anything to be real in the first place? Becomes sort of a circular reference. But either way, these are all just pointers that, in some respects, will fall on their face when pressure tested enough. So anyway, the relative, which is real and unreal, is the day-to-day experience. Again, it's a body that thinks, that hears, that sees, a body that needs to eat food, the body that needs shelter. There's the universe. There's this planet we're on. There's the moon. There's the sun. There's you know countless stars in the universe. There's other bodies. There's animals. There's computer screens, bigger and bigger portion of our relative experience in this age of humanity. So yeah, so the relative is just everything that is apparently happening. That word apparently is one that um, the more uncompromising non-dual speakers use quite a lot. Like if you haven't heard of Tony Parsons, Jim Newman, those sort of types of speakers, they use the word apparently a lot, and I really like that because it really sort of stops the analytical mind in its steps in a way, because it's a continual reminder that, like, this, what you're seeing, what's being seen, what's being heard, what's being smelled, what's being experienced is an apparent happening. It's apparently this, but in the absolute sense, it's indescribable, unknowable, being this apparent experience. And then, I think a really important part, for me at least, with this absolute and relative is it can be a challenge to not get hung up on one or the other. Like, for example, a pitfall that is often talked about is the absolute trap. That there's this relative happening, a body appearing in space that has a character that goes about life in apparent time. There can be the absolute pitfall that simply perpetually negates any reality of that whatsoever. And that's, it is true in the absolute sense that there is only the absolute. And that is extremely important. Well, I guess when you think about it, there's only the absolute, so there is nothing more important or less important. So, you know, apparently it's extremely important um, to recognize that, because it can really help on the path of a sense of ease with which life is done, with which life happens. And but at the same time, to be stuck in the absolute can be, I guess, limiting, stifling. To negate any, even if it's apparent, but to negate the experience of a body in space, in time, with relationships. That there's nothing wrong with the negation of all of that. There's nothing wrong with any of this. There's nothing wrong with listening to what I'm saying and thinking it's all crazy. Maybe it is. But either way, there's nothing wrong or right with any of it. It's just what's appearing to happen. It's just the absolute appearing as all of this. And, the beauty is that there is immense freedom in all of that. So, but again, to go back to the sort of finding the balance of the experiential recognition of this being absolute, the absolute, everything is the absolute, finding the balance of that, and also sort of a love and a compassion and a welcoming acceptance to this relative happening is I'm not supposing that I have the answers for that. I think that's the part of the deepening into this stuff is figuring out for oneself what that looks like, and if it's even necessary. Because again, there's nothing wrong with just sitting in the absolute and move to the Himalayas and just sit in the mountaintops. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's also nothing wrong with immersing oneself into the experience of being a human being. Okay, so before I wrap this up, I do want to touch on again the illusion, because if from the beginning we talked about absolute, the relative, and the illusion. So the illusion is what is unreal, and that is separation. So there's only the absolute. So there isn't the absolute and then something else. So there's the absolute appearing as all of this, but there isn't an absolute here and then an absolute there. So in that sense, there is no separation. There is no duality. I've often heard it said that, a duality is just the relative experience and, sort of conflating this duality, this illusion of existence with the relative. And again, there's nothing right or wrong with that view, but eventually it's seen that the duality simply isn't real. That there is only this absolute happening. There isn't another related happening to this. And the way that that manifests the most is within the person, within the body, that there is a dualism that arises, the experience of dualism arises in the body that has a here and a there, or probably more accurately, it has a split of experience in the body, a me that is thinking, that has thoughts. So the thoughts are happening to me. Everything happens in relation to me. So again, that illusory separation and dualism is this sense of me. And it's a very strong sense. So this isn't to say that it doesn't seem like it's real, that it doesn't, yeah, it's an apparent experience that seems very real, but through through a combination of some sort of experiential insight and inquiry, contemplation of that experience of me, it becomes clear that it has no reality to it whatsoever. It's sort of this phantom in the machine of the body that creates the whole grand story around this relative happening. And with that comes a lot of volatility, a lot of seeking for wholeness and fulfillment. That sense of separation seeks for fulfillment, and the irony is that it isn't real in the first place. So how can there be any fulfillment to something that isn't real? It's, some might say it's the cosmic joke, because it's so, this is the point in speaking where, there can be a more visceral response, because this is basically calling into question a key experience that every human being has had for probably the most majority of life, and yet it isn't real. Yeah, that's a lot. It's a really difficult thing to even think about, um, and the implications of all of that. But through that difficulty, again, whether it can be experiential, um, it ought be some blend of experiential or conceptual inquiry based, but there comes this deepening into a sense of lightness and peace that the body experiences with the reality. So, going back, it can become that it's the absolute appearing as a body, but that body is liberated, to use that term, liberated from a lot of that unnecessary suffering that arises from that illusory experience of me and everything else outside of me.